Hello my friends, and welcome to my first tanking guide. In this guide I want to aim towards beginners but also veterans alike. I've been tanking on Final Fantasy XIV since A Realm Reborn, so my tanking knowledge is pretty vast. I'm going to be covering everything that I can think of and I've put down into a Word document that I feel is essential to know as a tank for getting started, and also if you've been tanking for a while, maybe some things you've missed. I might not be able to cover every single little thing there is to do with tanking, which means there might be future short videos going over some of these things. If there's anything you guys can point out as well, then please do leave in the comments. Without further ado, let's just dive right into the video. So let's go over the role of tanking. Your main responsibilities as a tank is first and foremost having aggro, enmity of an enemy or enemies. Your next responsibility is mitigation, making sure you are mitigating damage to make your healer's life easier. They don't have to heal you as much, they can do DPS. And also prevent you from dying. Dying prevention is a huge responsibility on your part, no less than the healers. And your final responsibility as a tank is damage output. Considering your combos do high damage and you won't have anything better to do when you're in a boss fight or dungeons, then delivering a high output of damage is also one of our responsibilities. You should never think just because you're a tank, you are not responsible to deal high damage. Of course, you're not going to deal as much as a DPS, but you will be dealing a respectable amount of damage and being a huge contributor to your party and the speed of which you can clear dungeons or the speed of which you can clear raids and trial instances. So that will cover the basics of tanking. Let's go over the mentality of being a tank. A lot of tanks seem to think that they are special and they have a higher purpose than everyone else. This is not the case. As a tank, you have an equal responsibility to everyone else. Tanks are simply there to just take the brunt of the damage. Healers are simply there to heal, and DPS are simply there to DPS. When I say it like this, it sounds awfully basic and simple, but there's so much more to each and every single one of those roles, and because of that, you need to think as a tank, there's more to your role, but there's also more to the healer role, and there's also more to the DPS role. So you must know not to think you are better than anyone else. Be aware that you have equal responsibility to everyone else in the party. This should also help you with tank anxiety. Don't just think because you wiped or you died, it's all your fault. But also do take into consideration what you could have done better. Don't throw the blame on someone instantly. So that covers the mentality. I just want to really drill that into your head before we get into the nitty-gritty parts of the video. I really do feel that is an important thing as a tank. Just please don't think you're better than anyone else. I've been tanking for years and I've never had this thought ever, but some tanks do for some reason have this random thought that they think they are better, and it just really isn't the case. Let's talk about your comfort level as a tank. I feel like this is the next important part before we get on to the more interesting parts of this video. This is pretty simple really, just understand your own comfort level and also know the default. Now the default in most dungeons before level 50, and we'll get into that in a moment, is wall-to-wall pulls. So you'll be pulling one pack and then you'll be pulling another pack all the way to the wall, and then you're going to mitigate accordingly and make sure you're grouping up all these mobs appropriately. That is the default, and that is something you need to understand as a tank, even when it is your first time. But if you're not comfortable doing that, then just let your group know, let your party know. Be like, guys, I'm new to tanking, I might have anxiety from tanking, it's new to me. Please let me pace myself, and most players will understand. Now some players might pull for you, they might go ahead and pull because they're like, whatever. Those players are impatient, but just be the better person and take the aggro off that person who pulled, and then make sure we're popping cooldowns. And maybe after the pull, tell them, please, avoid doing that. I've told you that I'm not comfortable doing big pulls. And if they ignore you after that, then unfortunately it is what it is. You might just have to deal with a bad apple throughout a whole dungeon run. Moving on to role actions. I want to use this part of the video to quickly go over all the role actions tanks have access to. All tanks have access to Rampart. This is 20% mitigation for 20 seconds every 90 seconds. This is especially good on pretty much everything. It's good as a filler cooldown, it's good for tank busters, it's good for large pulls on dungeons, it's just an all-around good ability. Make sure we're using this and we're not just leaving it on CD for too long. This has so much value, we want to get all the value out we can get from this. Next we have low blow and interject. Low blow is our stun. This can be used in some raid instances when a mob can be stunned and add a mob. Sometimes this happens, but usually not. But alternatively, you can use this in dungeon packs. Maybe use low blow on the biggest target in a dungeon pack, and you'll mitigate the damage that that mob is doing to you. You can also use it to interrupt some casts, so maybe an AoE that is going out that a mob is doing, you can low blow the mob and that'll interrupt the AoE, and then yourself and the melee can stay on the trash pack and not risk getting hit by an AoE. Interject interrupts spells, but not all spells. They will be a sort of red in hue. Hopefully I'll have an example here showing you the exact spells that we can interrupt, and you should see what the cast bar sort of looks like. These can be used in raids and dungeon instances, so just be wary for that cast bar and make sure you're interrupting it with interject. Next we have reprisal. This is a small AoE around us that it's going to make everything it hits deal 10% less damage. This is great for raid wides, great for tank busters, and great for like big dungeon mob packs in trash. It's on a 60-second cooldown and it lasts 10 seconds on every single mob it affects, so this is extremely versatile and extremely good. Make sure you're taking full advantage of this ability. We then have arm's length. This is our anti-knockback ability. Say for instance in a raid or trial, the boss is casting a knockback, then we can use arm's length, and this is going to completely nullify that knockback, so we can keep uptime on the boss and not lose any damage or GCDs. This is also an excellent cooldown in dungeons, as it's going to create a barrier around ourselves that when any enemy strikes us, it's going to give them a 20% slow. This slow is going to reduce all their auto attacks by 20% and all their cast bars by 20%. So this is just incredibly good mitigation, and you should be taking advantage of this. We then have Provoke and Shirk. Provoke is essentially a tank swap ability, but it's also ability to peel a mob off someone who has an enemy and they shouldn't have it. Say if you're doing a big dungeon pull and someone has a straight enemy on them, then you can provoke and use your ranged attack and you'll be able to peel that mob off that person. It's also used in tank swaps along with Shirk. If there's a tank swap in a boss fight in a raid instance, then you'll use Provoke during the tank buster cast, which means after the cast the boss will be straight away on you as long as the other tank casts Shirk, and Shirk is going to give 25% of your enmity to the target. In this instance, we're hoping it's the other tank. That way we can have a seamless tank swap. So to summarize that, we use Provoke on an enemy that is casting a tank buster on our main tank. That main tank is then going to cast Shirk on us, and then as soon as the tank buster's gone out, the boss is going to be on us instead because we casted Provoke and they casted Shirk, creating a seamless tank swap. Also, while we're here, remember your tank stances. Every tank has a different stance: Warrior Defiance, Paladin Iron Will, Dark Knight Grit, and Gunbreaker Royal Guard. They all work exactly the same. So you have these on when you're actively tanking and have it turned off when you're not actively tanking. That said, the whole point of this Shirk thing is for its seamless tank swap, of course, but also so you don't have to worry too much about turning your tank stance off when you're actively off tanking. Just be wary of the aggro, the enmity, and if you're getting close, getting high on the enmity, then maybe turn your tank stance off if you're the off tank, so you don't overtake the main tank. Let's now move on to dungeons. Now, my first point in dungeons, which perfectly ties in with one of the previous points, is be wary of pulling wall to wall when it comes to sub 50 content especially. And the reason for this is because when we're not doing level 50 plus content, there's actually a few reasons. Not everyone has access to AoE in sub 50 content, so just evaluate who has access to AoE, who doesn't. Is it worth pulling all of this and potentially sacrificing your healer's DPS? Does your group have AoE? Like, there's a few things to think about. And then there's also, of course, the density of mob packs in sub 50 content is huge. There's so many mobs in sub 50 content as opposed to plus 50 content. So really, there's not too much more to talk about. Just be wary of this, you know, evaluate. Is it worth pulling wall to wall? Maybe pull a few packs and then stop, rather than pulling all the way to the next boss fight, because you can do that in sub 50 content. So yeah, just be wary of that. So let's move on to the AoE as a tank. I'm going to have some pictures up on the screen as we're talking through it, and if you follow the pictures, it's going to have either ×2, which means AoE on 2 or more targets with this AoE, or ×3, which means AoE on 3 or more targets of this AoE. I'll try and cover every single tank AoE in the game, so you can easily watch throughout this part of the video and evaluate which AoE is good on 2 or more targets and which one is good on 3 or more targets. Hopefully that helps and makes this part of the video a bit easier to digest. My next point is figuring out your mitigation cooldowns. So knowing what your mitigation cooldowns do, their timers, and sort of fix a cooldown rotation. When we're doing dungeons especially, we don't want to be saving cooldowns, mitigation cooldowns, for boss fights. A lot of tanks seem to do this, and a lot of tanks also seem to press cooldowns in a panic response. 2 damage, we don't want to do this. We want to, when we pull a mob pack, for example, if we pull a big mob pack wall to wall, then we want to use some cooldowns. If we don't take into account our invulnerabilities, then the first cooldown we probably want to pop is Rampart, and then after that, if the pack is still alive, maybe follow that with a filler CD, a reprisal, and an arm's length until it's dead. And then on the next mob pack, make sure we're using our big CD, so this is Vengeance, Sentinel, Nebula, and Shadow Wall. And then once that's over, we can go back to Rampart, and we'll be rotating our cooldowns in a pretty good manner. That's just an example you can follow, but do try and figure this stuff out for yourself. Know what the cooldowns do, figure out a CD rotation. This will become more of a big deal when it comes to raiding content. If you do run out of cooldowns, or you have cooldowns up but your healer's really struggling to keep you alive, then what you actually want to do is run circles around the mobs. Now this is going to kite them and delay their auto attacks and abilities. This is going to keep you alive. It's not such a huge thing on FF to kite bosses and avoid auto attacks, but it can work on trash pools and the likes, as it's going to delay auto attacks on you and delay the mobs. I don't recommend doing kiting all the time because it's going to misposition the enemies and it's going to be a little bit of a mess, but it can save your life, so do keep this in mind. You're getting really low, it's getting really sketchy, your healer doesn't have any more cooldowns, you don't have any more cooldowns, there's still trash alive, then do consider giving it a little kite, throwing out your stuns as well, that's another good thing. And just doing that to keep yourself alive and mitigate damage. Trust me, this is a little bit of maybe an advanced technique that not every tank would think of, but I feel like it's really important to add to this guide because this can save your life. It might save you a dungeon trash wipe, and avoiding wipes is just great because it's going to save you time and it's going to make your experience overall better. In these trash pools as well, it's very important, and this can also apply to raids by the way, is when you see a damaging puddle, so Ninja's Doton or Dark Knight's Salted Earth, or Summoner's Garuda little puddle thing, then you want to move your enemies or the boss into this puddle and make sure you're not losing damage on this puddle. You'll make the relevant person who owns the puddle very happy because you'll keep the boss or enemies in the puddle and that will increase their damage and kill the enemies or boss sooner. So that is great and they'll be thankful for that. They might not show it, but they will be thankful. You also have healing ones, so the ones that come to mind is Sacred Soil, Asylum, and Astro's Earthly Star. All of these are really gonna help you out as well, because as soon as you're in them, they're gonna be healing you, with the exception of Earthly Star, which will explode and then heal you, and you do want to catch that heal. So it's very important to stay in these and catch the heals that they are providing or mitigation that they are providing for you. So just be wary of these. Hopefully I would have shown some footage of what they look like as we're talking about them, just to give you an example of what they look like and how you can identify all of these healing, beneficial and damaging puddles to benefit from for your teammates' damage and the healing and mitigation output. Now that we've gone over like how we should be doing the dungeon mob packs and stuff, let's go into bosses. So first and foremost, when we pull a boss, make sure we're using our ranged attack and not our gap closer. I see a lot of tanks use their gap closer to pull a boss, and this is horrible for literally everyone involved other than the tank. It's horrible for casters and range because it's so unexpected and it's just out of nowhere, and you can't even mentally prep, let alone be prepared for that with cast times or whatever. At least when you're going to pull with your ranged attack, you're moving towards the boss and you're showing an intent to pull, and then you do your ranged attack. And even then, the ranged attack has an animation, so if you're not walking over to the boss, at least when you use your ranged attack, there's an animation there. Everyone can see that and everyone will be ready. Also, pulling with a gap closer really sucks for a melee DPS as well. If you're playing melee and your tank gap closes, you probably know the pain of this, because the boss will just stay where it is. Rather than when you pull with your ranged attack, it's going to move a little bit forward, closing that distance between you and the boss, which is just ideal as a melee DPS, and that is what you want. Now that we've pulled the boss, what we want to focus on is boss positioning. Defaultly, we're going to face the boss north, or at least away from the party. We do this because a lot of bosses cleave, so it's just good practice to keep the boss away from the party. Now, defaultly, we can continue to face the boss north even when it does a cast, it turns around, and then if we turn it again back to north, this is okay. But if you want to be a bit more advanced and you have a melee DPS, you don't need to do this if you don't have a melee DPS because it won't make a difference. And it could be easier to face a boss north without a melee DPS because it'll make people be able to relate and orientate themselves around the boss a lot easier if it's always facing north for mechanic. But if you do have a melee DPS, then everyone actually should be aware that it's actually beneficial when a boss turns to cast at someone else, and it does that for quite some time, then maybe consider as a tank going in front of the cast after it's finished. So if it's like a cleave aimed at someone, obviously don't go into that. But after the cast is finished, maybe go into the cleave once it's gone out, obviously, which will avoid the boss from spinning. And this will make the melee DPS life a lot easier because the boss won't turn, cast, and then turn again to the north. Instead, it's going to stay in a static location once it's turned once to do the cast. This is super beneficial for melees, and as a tank, it's good practice to practice this. Casters, healers, and ranged do have to be wary of this because it can mess with orientation. But honestly, if you have a melee, I would do this because it's just going to make their life a lot easier. Slightly tying into raids though, if your group agrees upon always having a boss face north, because it's going to be easier to orientate yourselves on mechanics, then you can pretty much move this point off, but I would practice it in dungeons and raid instances if there isn't a mechanic that you have to orientate yourself for. Another thing to note when you are positioning bosses and such is stutter stepping. Now hopefully I'm providing some footage of an example of what stutter stepping is, but basically what this is when you want to reposition a boss or drag a boss to a certain position. Then what you'll do is you'll move a bit, go in when your GCD resets are like a little bit halfway through it roughly, get the GCD in, move back out, so you continue to drag the boss, move back in, hit that GCD. It's very essential to keep the GCD rolling unless absolutely necessary where you cannot keep it rolling anymore. So when we are positioning as a tank, this is called stutter stepping. So go in for your GCD, when your GCD is on the roller, go out, make sure you're positioning. As soon as that comes back up, make sure you get that hit in, and then go back again and continue your positioning. Now I think we've gone over more or less everything that I could cover when it comes to dungeons. Let's move on to the real meat of this video. How are we going to be raiding as a tank? Because we've already talked about shirk and provoke in the role action part of the video, we'll skip that. And if you want to know more about how to tank swap, then go back to that and watch that. Which leads me on to my first point of raiding. And I feel like this is a pretty essential thing to know, but also just a lot of people aren't aware of this, is defensives aren't just there exclusively for tank busters. They're there for autos and filler damage as well. You want to be rotating your CDs. Just like how I explained in my dungeon part of the video, you want to be rotating your CDs, learning what the CDs do, and figuring out a cooldown rotation here. Of course, this can be slightly different to how we do things in dungeons, so just to keep this in mind. We always want a CD for tank busters, but say if a tank buster doesn't come out for the next 100 seconds into a fight, and we have a rampart, and rampart is on our 90-second cooldown, we can get away with a rampart usage pretty much like at the beginning of the fight there, for example, and then we won't have to worry about not having it up for the tank buster. Also, don't think that you'll need rampart for a tank buster either. You can opt in for another CD, perhaps your utility CD, so Dark Knight, TBN, Oblation, Paladin, Shieldtron, Gunbreaker, Heart of Corundum, and Warrior Bloodwetting, the list goes on. You also have your big defensive CDs, we've been over these, but you know, Vengeance, Sentinel, Nebula, Shadow Wall. You can use these on tank busters too, but you can also use these on filler damage. Again, say if you use Nebula on a tank buster, and then Nebula comes back up, this is just an example, this applies to all the big tank CDs, then you might be able to get away with using Nebula again, and then another 120 seconds pass, and then a tank buster comes out, and then you can use your Nebula for that. For example, this is just an example and hopefully a very easy one to understand, just make sure we're using CDs for autos when we can and we can get away with it. And why do we do this? To help the healers, obviously, right? To prevent them from having to cast a GCD heal on us, which gives them an extra cast of damage, which is going to make the raid instance die quicker, help us meet in rage timers, maybe push a phase into the next phase, and that's going to prevent damage altogether. The list goes on of why you want to do this. Also, it's just good for progression when you're progging a fight and everything's a bit sketch and all over the place. It's just going to be good overall. So, you know, make sure you're taking advantage of your cooldowns and not just leaving there to sit for too long. That is the last thing you want. Another thing to note is using your raid utility as a tank. So our big raid utility is probably Reprisal. We want to make sure we're using these on raid wides, on tank busters, and even auto attacks if we get the chance. Now, auto attacks isn't so important because there's usually a raid wide or a tank buster at least in raid instances every 60 seconds or so. So as the two tanks, we can rotate these between ourselves and making sure we're getting them on every raid wide at the very least, and maybe some tank busters as a little bonus. We don't need them on tank busters as much, but if we can get away with putting them on tank busters, then we should. That's another thing. If you're properly raiding with another tank, then you need to talk about your usage of reprisals. So you're not overlapping each other's reprisals. This is the last thing you want to do because that's just a massive waste of such a valuable cooldown. The effect isn't going to stack, so it's just detrimental to do this. So make sure you're communicating with your tank when you're going to do your reprisal and when they're going to do their reprisal. Talk about it as two tanks. And if you're in a voice chat, maybe just communicate it in the fight. Say, for example, you're a tank that wants to take a bit of charge. Say, this is your reprisal, next one is mine. Just remind them, be a helpful team player. That will really go to lengths as a tank. I know this as I've been tanking for years, and just saying that is going to remind yourself, and it's going to also remind you of a tank, so it's super helpful. On top of this, you have your AoE utility. I'm going to cover all of these real quick, but they all essentially do the same thing. You have Shake It Off, you have Divine Veil, you have Heart of Light, and you have Dark Missionary. All of these are your AoE utility, and you want to take advantage of these. These all can stack as tanks, but ideally we don't want to stack them unless the damage is going to hit us really hard. We want to sort of rotate them slightly like Reprisal, although it's not so much of a waste if we use them together. Say if there's a really hard hitting fight, a few ultimate fights are like this, so if you're keen on going into ultimate raids, then this is good knowledge to know. If an AoE is going out and it's going to hit you super hard, one tank reprisal, one tank use their AoE, and then maybe there's another AoE straight after, the other tank use their reprisal, and then one tank use their AoE. So you'll basically be rotating your reprisals and your AoEs as two tanks, and this is really going to just help out your whole group as a whole, keep them alive, keep them healthy. Remember, as a tank, mitigating damage is a big part of your responsibility, and keeping your party alive is also a big part of it. I have a few more points. Another point is making use of invulnerabilities. These are super important as a tank and they have so much value to us. Unless you're a Dark Knight and you have Living Dead. I'm kidding, but please Square Enix, please rework this. Seriously though, making use of these invulnerabilities is vital. We can use invulnerabilities to cheese tank swaps, cheese big tank busters, completely negate the healer having to use heals on us, or shields, or cooldowns, or anything in that matter, and just increasing their DPS overall, or making their lives just generally easier, which is just healthy for the group as a whole. So make sure we're taking advantage of our invulnerabilities as a tank, as these are super duper important to us. Another really important thing is taking advantage of our utility. This can also be applied to dungeons, by the way, but every tank has another party member utility. This includes TBN and Oblation for Dark Knight, Nas and Flash for Warrior, Intervention and Cover for Paladin, and Heart of Corundum as a Gunbreaker. We can really clutch up with these abilities, really save someone's life. For example, as a warrior, we can heal someone pretty much to max. As a Dark Knight, we can give someone a big shield. As a Paladin, we can give someone a regen and a big amount of mitigation. And as a Gunbreaker, we can give someone an insta-heal and on top of that, some mitigation. There's more to it than that, but of course, when it comes to clutching up and saving someone, this can really help out. Say if there's an AoE going out and a DPS or a healer took a vulnerability stack, or even your other tank, you can pop your util on them, help them out a bit, and maybe even make them survive the follow-up AoE that's going to come out when they're low on health and they have a vulnerability stack. Just keep this in mind. If your utility ability is off CD and you see this situation happening, then take full advantage of this and try your best to save someone. This is going to be super helpful for progression, super helpful for just killing a fight and getting out of the way, because you're going to just make it go faster and more smooth, and it's just good in general. It's good practice. Clutch up as a tank. Tank is a big clutching role, which leads me into my last point. As a tank, you must know that clutching is a big part of your kit. Of course, I don't want to convince you that you should be popping your CTs when you panic. Everything should be in such a way that you know when to pop them, because you want to prevent damage. But if you see a situation like this arising, then you can save a thing or two and save someone with a cooldown. As I said, this is a big responsibility on you. No one's actually going to blame you if you don't manage to do it, but clutching as a tank is going to make you from a good tank to a really good tank. And people will really appreciate that. Some people might not notice it, but hell, if you notice it and you just save someone's life, then give yourself a pat on the back, because who cares what other people think? You know you did it. On top of that, we have limit break. A lot of people seem to just ignore limit break as a tank, and this is honestly a mistake, but it's not a bad mistake. As I've said, this kind of leads into the utility part. This separates a good tank to a really good tank. Let's think of a good example for this. So say if there's a stack AoE or an AoE in general, we have a few people dead for a stack, for example, and not everyone's there for the stack. So what are we going to do? Maybe only one healer's alive. We only have a handful of people for the stack, but we have LB 2 or 3 or even 1. Then pop that LB and help out. You might just save the group. And honestly, people notice a good tank LB more than they notice a individual life save. They'll probably be thankful if you manage to LB. And there's nothing better than people saying good tank LB in chat. Honestly, you get so much serotonin from just people saying that. So just make sure you're aware of this. Same goes for when an AoE is going out, not just stack markers. So an AoE goes out, maybe a healer's dead, everyone is low on health, and you're not really sure what to do, what's going to happen. You have tank LB 1, 2, or 3. Use it. You might just save the run. You might just save the party. If everything is going to hell anyway, and you're like, oh god, but what if I tank LB 3 this? And the healer could a healer be freed? Honestly, don't worry about it. If the healer doesn't survive the spread or the stack, what's that gonna matter anyway? If it's only tanks gonna be surviving in the end, then it won't matter. So just use that LB. Okay guys, and I think that'll probably do it for the video. I feel like I've dragged on a lot of these points more than they should be, but hopefully in the editing process it'll all work out and make sense. If I've missed anything that you find is super important, then please do let me know in the comments below. If I deem it like even more important than you might deem it, or on an equal level, then maybe I'll make a follow-up video and cover a few more points when it comes to tanking. Because I can't guarantee that I've remembered or thought to cover everything important, and hell, you might even teach me a thing or two. Probably not, but you might. I don't say that to be egotistical, I've just been tanking for so long. But you might, so you know what, surprise me. If you enjoyed the video, then please do give it a thumbs up. That would really help me a bunch. I've been growing pretty damn well from doing FF content, and I really do enjoy covering FF content, so that is the focus of this channel now. I would really appreciate you liking this video a bunch. And if you do enjoy this content, you enjoy guides, then please do consider subscribing as well. Instance related content and job related content, that you can expect guides on pretty much everything there is to do with instance based content. So if that is something you're interested in, then please do consider hitting that subscribe button. It would really help me a bunch. And that'll do it for the video. I really appreciate it if you've made it all the way to the end. But to not drag this video on any longer, I will see you guys in the next one. My next guide will probably be a guide on one of the Savage fights, or it might be a guide on Sage. I am working on the Sage guide. I've practiced Sage a lot. I'm quite comfortable with Sage now, so do expect that sometime this week. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you guys again. Take it easy, stay safe, we out, peace.